Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. I'd love to know. And if you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. All right, let's jump in. The morning had started like any other. People moved through their routines, the world spinning as it always had. Children laughed as they rushed to school. People filled the streets on their way to work, and the quiet hum of everyday life echoed from all corners of the world. The air was thick with the mundane, the groan of coffee machines, the honk of traffic, the distant chatter of small talk. No one could have known that in the blink of an eye, everything would change. Then, without warning, the sky cracked. It wasn't thunder or lightning. It wasn't some freak storm or military test gone wrong. The sky tore open, wide and violent, as though some ancient force had split it in half. Through that tear, they came. Massive ships, dark as the void itself, their hulls shimmering with a metallic sheen that seemed to absorb the light around them. The first ship was the size of a skyscraper, its engines humming with a deep, unnatural sound that rattled the bones of anyone within miles of its arrival. At first, people couldn't comprehend what was happening. Was it a prank? A new military experiment? A meteor shower gone rogue? But then, one by one, cities began to fall. First, New York, gone in the blink of an eye, erased from existence like a flicker of static on a screen. Then Tokyo, Paris, the world's capitals, the heartbeats of civilization wiped from the map without so much as a warning. Governments scrambled, their best minds coming together in a panic. They fired nuclear missiles at the ships, sending every jet they could find into the sky. Nothing worked. The alien technology was beyond anything humanity had ever seen. Missiles fell out of the sky, planes were turned to ashes before they even reached their targets. It was as if the aliens were toying with them, like ants beneath a boot that never even noticed them. And in that moment, a chilling fear swept over the planet. This wasn't just a battle. It was an extinction event. Humanity was powerless. The skies, once the domain of humankind, were now the home of invaders. It felt like the end. But Earth wasn't done yet. There was still one person who refused to bow. In a small town in Montana, far from the bombed-out cities, a man named Marcus Lane sat in his home, watching the world fall apart on his television. He had long since retired from his work in military engineering. He wasn't supposed to be involved in this, but Marcus knew things that most people didn't. For 30 years, he'd built weapons, machines, and tools so deadly that even governments had buried them. The world didn't need to know how dangerous the things he built could be. But now, as the cities burned and the world trembled, Marcus understood. There was no time for fear anymore. As the alien ships moved closer, wiping out everything in their path, Marcus Lane went to his basement. He had no idea if it would work. He had no idea what it would cost. But he knew one thing. If he didn't try, humanity wouldn't last another day. 3 days. That was all it took for Marcus to build something from scraps. An old satellite dish, wires, an old pickup truck, and the remnants of forbidden military technology. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't what anyone would have expected to save the world. But when Marcus turned it on, the sky itself seemed to groan. He aimed the dish at the nearest alien ship and fired. The ship didn't explode. It didn't crash. It just disappeared. No smoke, no wreckage. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, like it had never existed. For the first time since the invasion began, the aliens stopped. Their ships paused in mid-air, their movements suddenly unsure. It was a moment of confusion, and for the first time in days, there was a flicker of hope. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. He didn't have a solution. He just had a delay. Sitting in his truck, Marcus took a breath. He wasn't sure if it would matter, but he picked up the radio anyway. His voice cracked as he spoke into the microphone, broadcasted to the invading ships. Earth to the invaders, attack again, and face total annihilation. For a long moment, there was nothing. Silence stretched across the land, thick and oppressive. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, the alien ships retreated. They didn't announce their departure. They didn't even say a word. They just disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the quiet hum of the Earth as it tried to process what had just happened. Humanity had survived. For now. But Marcus Lane knew this was far from over. The aliens would return, smarter, more prepared. Earth wasn't out of danger, not by a long shot. But for the first time since the invasion started, people weren't just running. They weren't just hiding. They were fighting back. And somewhere, in the vast stretches of space, the invaders were watching. Not Badavide. The world had been moving at its usual pace. People went about their lives, unaware that the tranquility of daily existence was about to be shattered. Children hurried off to school. Commuters sighed at the thought of another busy day at work, and the hum of urban life echoed in every corner of the globe. It was business as usual. But then everything changed in an instant. The sky split open like a curtain ripped in two, and through that tear, they arrived. Massive ships, black and metallic, with sharp angles that seemed to cut through the air itself, emerged from the rift. Their sound was like a deep, humming vibration that made the air itself tremble. At first it seemed surreal, like a strange illusion. People speculated about military tests or bizarre weather anomalies, but that illusion shattered when the first explosion rang out in the distance, and the city of Los Angeles, once a bustling metropolis, was simply erased. Cities began to fall, one after another. Paris, Berlin, Sydney, all gone in the blink of an eye. It wasn't just destruction, it was annihilation. There were no demands, no messages, no negotiations, just an overwhelming, unstoppable force destroying everything in its path. As the death toll rose, humanity's desperation reached new heights. Leaders tried everything: nuclear strikes, advanced weaponry, fighter jets, but nothing even touched the invaders. The alien ships absorbed everything with ease, their technology light years ahead of anything mankind had. The world seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. This wasn't a fight. It was a slaughter. The very air felt heavy, thick with fear. People everywhere realized the awful truth. The planet was no longer theirs. The skies, once filled with human-made aircraft, were now occupied by a terrifying presence that seemed indifferent to the lives it was destroying. But, as dark as the future seemed, one man refused to accept defeat. In a small town in Montana, far from the chaos of the burning cities, a man named Marcus Lane sat quietly in his house, watching the world crumble on his old, dusty television. He was a retired engineer, a man who had spent his life designing weapons for the military, technology so secret, so dangerous, that even governments had buried it deep underground, afraid of what might happen if it ever saw the light of day. As the cities burned and the countdown to Earth's destruction ticked closer, Marcus knew something had to be done. He couldn't sit idly by while humanity faced extinction. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about fighting back. While the world's leaders huddled in their bunkers, Marcus worked alone in his basement. He wasn't sure what would happen, or if anything would even work, but he knew that if he didn't try, there would be nothing left to save. Using scrap metal, discarded electronics, and remnants of the very weapons that had once been deemed too dangerous to use, Marcus began to build. It wasn't much, a haphazard collection of parts that looked more like a junkyard project than a weapon of salvation. But in his hands, it was their only hope. 3 days later, when the invaders moved on to the next city, Marcus finished. He didn't hesitate. He climbed into his old, rusted pickup truck, strapped his creation to the back, and aimed it at the nearest alien ship. When he pulled the trigger, the ground beneath him shook, the sky rippled, and in a single, deafening pulse, the alien ship vanished. There was no explosion, no crash. It simply ceased to exist, as though it had never been there at all. For a moment, everything stopped. The alien ships hovered in place, confused, uncertain. They hadn't expected resistance, not from Earth, not from humanity. But for the first time since the invasion began, they hesitated. Marcus knew this wasn't over. He had no illusions about that. They had been forced to retreat, but the invaders would come back, stronger, more prepared. Still, for the first time in days, Marcus felt a sliver of hope. Humanity wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. He sat quietly, catching his breath, then reached for the radio, sending out a message. Earth to the invaders, attack again, and face total annihilation. For what seemed like an eternity, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the ships turned, their engines humming as they retreated into the hole they had torn in the sky. In moments, they were gone, leaving behind a dark, still sky. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief, but just for a moment. Marcus knew it wasn't over. Not yet. He looked out over the quiet town, his mind racing with the knowledge that the war had only just begun. And though the alien forces had retreated for now, he knew one thing for sure. Earth had given them a warning. And this time, it was not a threat. It was a promise. Marcus sat in the truck, staring at the dark sky above him. His hand still gripped the radio, his knuckles white with tension. It was over, for now. The alien ships had retreated, and the silence left behind was deafening. The world had not been obliterated, at least not yet. But that feeling, the same one that had plagued him for the last 3 days, hadn't gone away. It gnawed at him, a constant reminder that the invaders weren't finished. They would come back, and next time, they would be ready. He could hear the distant sounds of the town settling back into a strange, tentative calm. It wasn't victory. It wasn't even a reprieve. It was a brief pause, a fragile moment before the storm. The streets that had once been filled with chaos and fear were now eerily quiet, as if everyone was still waiting for the other shoe to drop. Marcus took a deep breath, pushing aside the uncertainty that clung to him like a second skin. He hadn't been a soldier in years, and even then he had never been the kind to stand at the front lines. He was an engineer, a creator, a man who built things that made other people's wars possible. But this was different. The enemy wasn't human. There were no rules, no borders, no compromise. The aliens didn't care who you were or what you believed. They came, they conquered, and they erased everything in their path. Humanity hadn't been just fighting for survival. It had been fighting for its place in the universe. And Marcus Lane, for reasons he still didn't fully understand, had become the linchpin in that battle. But as the reality of what he had done began to settle in, a new thought crept into his mind, colder and sharper than any fear he had felt before. What if it wasn't enough? What if the alien forces had only retreated because they were preparing for something worse, something far more devastating than the weapon he had just used? What if they hadn't underestimated humanity at all? What if they were simply biding their time, waiting for the perfect moment to finish what they had started? Marcus knew that he had no answers to these questions. No one did. The technology he had used to drive the invaders back wasn't something humanity understood. It was something he had cobbled together in desperation, using ideas that were buried in military archives, ideas so dangerous that governments had decided they were better off left untouched. And now, with the briefest taste of victory, Marcus realized that the world had no plan beyond what he had done. No contingency, no backup. Just one man, one weapon, and a temporary victory that could evaporate in an instant. He didn't have the answers. But he knew one thing for certain. He was the only one who had even the slightest clue about how to fight back. And that meant he had a responsibility. Whether he liked it or not, Marcus Lane was the world's last hope. He climbed out of the truck, his bones creaking as he stretched, and walked back toward his house. The small town of Bozeman, Montana, had always been quiet, tucked away in the hills like a forgotten relic. But now, after the invasion, it felt like the epicenter of the world's last stand. People were still gathering in the streets, trying to make sense of the chaos, some with smiles on their faces, others looking lost, unsure of what to do next. Everyone was talking about the same thing: the alien ships, the destruction, and most of all, Marcus's weapon. They had all seen it work. They had all seen the impossible happen. And they all knew that the world owed its survival to Marcus Lane. He didn't feel like a hero, though. Heroes had plans, they had answers, they had a future. Marcus had none of those. He was just a man who had made a choice when no one else could. But the truth was, even that brief moment of success hadn't come without a cost. The invaders had retreated, yes, but Marcus had no illusions about why. It wasn't because they were afraid of humanity. It wasn't because they respected Earth's defenses. No, it was simply because they had no idea what had just happened. They didn't understand the weapon he had used, and they didn't know how to counter it. But they would learn. It was only a matter of time before they figured it out. Marcus had made a promise. He had told them to attack again and face total annihilation. But he didn't have any backup. There was no plan B, no second weapon, no real strategy. What he had built was a one-time miracle, a device cobbled together from scrap, something that defied all logic, something that, for a split second, had given humanity the upper hand. But how long could they hold on to that? How long could one weapon, one man, hold back an entire invasion? As Marcus stood in the doorway of his house, watching the people of Bozeman gather in the streets, he could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him. The government would come soon. They would send teams to investigate, to study the device. They would want to understand how it worked, how to replicate it, how to build more. And Marcus knew they wouldn't be content with just studying it. They would want control, they would want power, and the moment they did, everything would change. The world was still recovering from the chaos, from the devastation that had swept through cities and left nothing but ashes in its wake. There was no way to rebuild without the rest of the world's governments scrambling for control. There was no way to make sure that the invaders wouldn't return and finish what they had started. A man who had been sitting by the front steps of Marcus's house stood up. He was older, his face lined with exhaustion and fear, but there was a fire in his eyes, a glimmer of something that hadn't been there before. He had seen the invaders firsthand. He had watched his own town burn to the ground. And now, with the briefest taste of hope, he was ready to fight. "Marcus," the man called. "What now?" "We can't just sit here and wait. We need to be ready. The rest of the world might be rebuilding, but we need to stay ahead of them. We can't let them think they've won. Not yet." Marcus turned, locking eyes with the man. His mind was spinning, full of thoughts, of plans, of possibilities, and yet none of them felt real. "You're right," Marcus said slowly, his voice rough. "But we don't even know how this weapon works, and the aliens will come back. They'll be ready next time, and we won't be." The man nodded, understanding the gravity of Marcus's words. "So, what do we do?" he asked. Marcus took a long, steadying breath. He didn't have an answer yet. But there was one thing he knew for sure. The world couldn't sit idly by. The aliens wouldn't give up. And neither could they. The time for waiting was over. "We fight," Marcus said, his voice steady now, firm. "We prepare, and we make sure we're ready when they come back." And with that, the next phase of humanity's struggle began. The weight of his own words hung in the air. It wasn't just a statement, it was a declaration. Marcus knew that the world couldn't afford to wait any longer. They had already seen what the invaders were capable of. They had seen entire cities wiped off the face of the earth, heard the desperate cries of the survivors, and felt the terror that permeated the air. Humanity's very existence had been threatened. And now that they had been given a second chance, however fleeting, it was time to make sure they didn't squander it. The man who had spoken to Marcus, the one who had asked the question, "What now?" stood silent for a moment, digesting what Marcus had said. Then, as if the words had finally settled in, his expression hardened. There was a resolve there now, something different in the way he held himself. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a soldier, a part of something bigger than himself. "We'll need more than just weapons," the man said, his voice low but filled with purpose. "We'll need a plan. We'll need people. We'll need to build something we can use. We can't just hope the next wave will be as dumb as the last one. We need to take the fight to them." Marcus didn't have a ready response. The man was right. They couldn't just rely on whatever luck or desperation had fueled his last-minute solution. The world's survival couldn't rest in the hands of one man and a single device. No, they needed an army that knew how to fight, how to strategize, and most importantly, how to survive the next wave. Marcus took a long, hard look at the small group that had gathered in the town square. It wasn't much. Just a handful of people, maybe 100, who had survived the initial assault. But in their eyes, he could see the same determination that had sparked in the man who had spoken up, the same fire that had driven him to stand tall in the face of annihilation. They had all lost something in this war. Some had lost homes, others families, and many had lost everything. But what they had gained, through the sheer will to survive, was something that few would understand until the invaders returned. They had gained unity. Marcus had always been a man of science and logic, driven by equations and blueprints. He had never been much of a leader, never wanted to be. But in this moment, surrounded by the remnants of the world's last defense, he felt something stir deep within him. He couldn't escape this. He couldn't just go back to being the man who built things. He was the spark now. He was the man who had given humanity a chance. The next steps fell squarely on his shoulders. "We need to start making contact," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the weight pressing down on him. "We need to find the others, the ones who are still out there, the survivors, the ones who've been hiding in the shadows. We need to tell them what happened. We need to spread the word. But we also need to prepare. We need resources, weapons, a real plan to defend ourselves." The man who had first spoken nodded, his eyes narrowing with focus. "I can help with that," he said. "I know people in the nearby towns, survivors. Some of them have military backgrounds. They'll listen to us if we make it clear we're not just sitting ducks waiting to die." Marcus didn't hesitate. "Then we get moving. We can't waste any time. I'll need all the help I can get to get the device I built ready for any possible counterattack. But it's going to take more than just that. We need more firepower, more brains, more manpower." As the man gathered a few others to start reaching out to neighboring towns and communities, Marcus walked back to his house. He had to think. He had to figure out what came next. The weapon that had worked before was not going to be enough. They had only managed to catch the invaders off guard because they hadn't known what to expect. Next time, Marcus knew they wouldn't be so lucky. He went straight to his basement, the place where it all began. It was cold down there, the air stale with dust and the faint scent of burnt metal. He looked at the makeshift weapon he had built. It didn't look like much. It wasn't much. A satellite dish, a tangle of wires, a few spare parts that had once belonged to old military equipment. But it had worked. For a moment, it had turned the tide of the battle. The invaders had retreated, their ships fleeing into the hole they had torn in the sky. But Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the fact that the device hadn't been designed for combat. It wasn't meant to be a weapon of war. It had just been a desperate measure, an act of ingenuity born from a moment of fear. And that fear had made it effective. But now, Marcus understood something. Fear wasn't enough. What they needed wasn't just another lucky shot. They needed to be prepared. They needed a force strong enough to repel the invaders, strong enough to stand against whatever weapons the aliens would bring next. He moved over to the workbench in the corner of the room, his hands already reaching for tools. He needed to rebuild. But not just the device. He needed to understand the aliens' technology. He needed to understand how it worked. If he could reverse engineer what had been used against them, maybe, just maybe, they could start developing weapons that could hold their own in a full-scale fight. It wasn't going to be easy. The invaders' ships were unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. They didn't just travel through space. They tore through the very fabric of the atmosphere, leaving ripples in the sky itself. Their ships were made from a material that seemed to defy the laws of physics, an alloy that was impervious to any human-made weapon. But that wasn't going to stop Marcus. He had always been a man who saw problems as challenges to be solved. And this was the biggest challenge he had ever faced. He needed help. Marcus looked up from his workbench. The world was out there, still reeling from the devastation, but he wasn't alone anymore. The survivors had formed something new in their pain and fear. They had created a unity that he could work with. The people in Bozeman were no longer just refugees. They were the beginning of something much bigger. Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He wasn't expecting anyone, but he knew who it was. The man who had spoken earlier, the one who had urged Marcus to act, had returned. With him was a small group: military veterans, survivors, engineers, and scientists from nearby towns who had heard the call. They were all here for one reason: to fight. And they were willing to do whatever it took to make sure humanity didn't lose again. "We're ready," the man said, stepping into the room. "We've got people on the way, supplies too. It's time to start planning for real." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of what was about to happen. This was it. There was no turning back now. The aliens would come again, and this time, humanity would be ready. He turned back to the workbench. There was a long road ahead of them. The stakes had never been higher. But for the first time since the invasion began, Marcus felt like there was a chance. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Not padavde. The days that followed were a blur of activity, urgency, and relentless determination. Marcus barely slept. Every hour he could spare was spent in the basement, piecing together what little he could salvage from the wreckage of both human and alien technology. The survivors who had gathered in Bozeman weren't idle either. The town, once just a sleepy dot on a map, had become the beating heart of Earth's last hope. Every corner of the town had transformed into a makeshift workshop or training ground, each person offering what they could to the cause. As the days passed, Marcus saw something remarkable begin to take shape. The town, which had been on the brink of panic and hopelessness, was coming together. The survivors had started to feel something they hadn't felt since the first wave of the invasion. Purpose. For the first time, they weren't just hiding from the inevitable, they were preparing to face it head-on. The veterans, many of whom had been sitting idly by for days, began to train the civilians. Marcus had never been in the military. He had never fired a gun in battle, nor did he consider himself a leader of men. But the veterans knew what had to be done, and they were more than willing to teach the others. By the time the second wave of survivors arrived from nearby towns, Bozeman was already becoming a small but organized force. The newly arrived engineers and scientists brought with them valuable knowledge that Marcus knew would be essential. While others worked on fortifying the town, designing defensive measures, and gathering supplies, Marcus focused on what had brought him here in the first place: the weapon. He had always been a man of logic, numbers, and calculations, but now he was grasping for something far more elusive. What he had built, that crude device, had stopped the invaders once, but Marcus knew that was just the beginning. The invaders would be back soon, smarter, stronger, and more prepared. And whatever they had come for, whatever they sought in humanity, they were going to bring something even worse next time. His job wasn't finished, not by a long shot. "Marcus, you need to see this." A voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see Sarah, one of the engineers who had joined their cause a few days earlier, standing in the doorway of his basement. Her face was flushed with excitement, her eyes bright with the kind of energy he hadn't seen in weeks. Marcus stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, and followed her. His mind, still cluttered with designs and calculations, barely registered the need for a break. But Sarah was insistent, and she had proven to be as sharp as any scientist or military strategist. They made their way through the basement and out into the town square, where a large tent had been set up as a temporary command center. Inside, a large group of people was gathered around a table covered with maps, blueprints, and electronic devices. Sarah walked up to the table, tapping a finger on a blueprint that was laid out in front of them. "This is the key to what we need," she said, her voice steady but brimming with excitement. "We've been studying the alien tech, and we've made a breakthrough." Marcus leaned over the table, squinting at the designs. His mind immediately began to process the information. Schematics of alien energy patterns, broken down components, and systems that seemed incomprehensible at first glance. He could see it now. What they had uncovered was an energy conversion system, a method for harnessing the power from the invaders' ships and turning it into something they could use. "We've discovered a way to reverse engineer their technology," Sarah explained, her fingers tracing the lines of the blueprint. "We believe we can adapt it to create a weapon that can harness their own energy against them." Marcus felt a rush of adrenaline. The idea was brilliant, yet it terrified him. What Sarah was proposing wasn't just about creating another weapon, it was about turning the tide of the war. If they could pull it off, they could level the playing field, or at least make sure they weren't as defenseless as they had been before. The problem was that this technology was alien. No one on Earth understood it fully, and the learning curve was steep. But there was no time for hesitation. Marcus looked up from the blueprint, meeting Sarah's gaze. "How long until we can build it?" he asked, his voice taut with urgency. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before answering. "It'll take time, but we've already made significant progress. We can start construction tomorrow, but it will take weeks to fully integrate the power source. The energy converter needs to be precise, or it could overload, and we don't want to risk blowing up half the town." Marcus nodded. They didn't have weeks. The invaders would be back far sooner than they expected. They needed to move faster. But Sarah was right. It had to be done carefully, or else their last chance could very well become their undoing. "We'll need all the resources we can gather," Marcus said, rubbing his temples as he tried to think through the logistics. Start pulling in everything we can use from the nearby towns. All the spare parts, the tech, anything we can salvage from the wreckage of the alien ships. And I need every person who can help with the calculations. We can't afford mistakes. Sarah nodded and quickly turned to relay the orders to the others. But Marcus stayed behind for a moment, lost in thought. There was so much they didn't know. He had been working with limited information, piecing together what he could from scraps. But the aliens were smarter than that. The energy converter was a good first step, but it wasn't enough. The next wave of invaders would have countermeasures in place. They would have seen what Earth had done and adjusted accordingly. The fear that had been gnawing at Marcus's insides ever since the alien ships retreated was starting to claw its way back to the surface. The invaders were not going to underestimate humanity again. He had made them retreat once, but that was all. And the thought of being unprepared for the next wave was enough to make his stomach turn. As the days passed, the town worked tirelessly. The veterans drilled civilians on combat tactics, preparing them for a future battle. The engineers and scientists were hard at work, poring over the alien technology and the designs Marcus had created. Slowly, the foundation of their defense began to take shape. The energy converter was the centerpiece of their plan, but there were other elements being developed as well. Improvised weapons, defense systems, and traps meant to slow the invaders down when they returned. Marcus had done his part by pushing the boundaries of human innovation, but now it was up to the rest of the town to do their part. It wasn't just about machines or weapons anymore. It was about survival, about human resilience in the face of extinction. One evening, after a long day spent reviewing blueprints and calculations, Marcus stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the town. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and for a moment he allowed himself to close his eyes and simply breathe. He needed to center himself, to remember why he was doing this. This wasn't just for survival. It was for the future. The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. Sarah walked up to him, holding a piece of paper in her hands. She looked serious, her face set with determination. "Marcus, we've got a problem," she said, her voice tense. "What is it?" he asked, his stomach dropping. "We've received a transmission," she said, her eyes scanning the paper in her hands. "From an unknown source. It's encrypted, but we've managed to crack it, and it's from the invaders." Marcus's blood ran cold. He hadn't expected them to reach out this soon. He had thought they would remain in hiding, waiting to gather strength for the next phase of the invasion. Sarah looked up at him, her voice tight. "They're coming." Marcus felt a chill sweep over him, the weight of Sarah's words sinking deep into his bones. The invaders were coming, and they weren't just coming for revenge. They were coming with a purpose. A part of him had always known this moment would come, but the cold certainty of it was still enough to make his heart race. "They've sent a message?" he asked, his voice hoarse as his mind began to process the implications. The invaders didn't communicate with humanity. They hadn't needed to before. Their weapons had spoken louder than any words ever could. But now they had reached out. Sarah nodded, her expression grim. "Yes, and it's not a warning this time. It's a statement. They want to make it clear that we've only delayed the inevitable. The message is chilling." Marcus took the paper from Sarah, unfolding it slowly. He felt the weight of each word as he read through it, his eyes scanning the cryptic language, which had been translated with careful precision. It wasn't a threat in the way he had expected. No, it was something far more unsettling. "Your defiance has been noted. You have made your stand, but you will fall. Your resistance is but an illusion. We will come again, stronger and smarter. The time for mercy has passed. Prepare for annihilation. Marcus read the message again, trying to make sense of it. His stomach churned. The invaders didn't just intend to conquer, they intended to break humanity's spirit. The very idea that they had singled out humanity's resistance, acknowledged it, and dismissed it with such cold finality sent a tremor of dread through him. This wasn't a war for territory. This wasn't a war for resources. This was a war for dominance, for total destruction. "What does this mean?" Marcus asked. His voice strained as he turned to Sarah. "If they're not just going to come and destroy us, they're coming for something more. This isn't about weapons. This is about erasing us." Sarah didn't reply immediately, her eyes distant as she processed the message. "I don't know," she said finally. "But whatever it means, it's clear we need to move faster. If they can destroy us psychologically as well as physically, we're not just facing an army. We're facing a force of will. We need more than just weapons. We need hope. And that's something we haven't been able to give the world yet." Marcus's mind raced. He had been so focused on the technology, on the logistics of creating the energy converter and adapting the alien tech, that he hadn't truly stopped to consider the psychological warfare at play. The aliens weren't just invading. They were undermining humanity's will to fight. They were aiming to break the spirit of resistance before they even stepped foot on the planet. And if they succeeded in doing that, the battle would be over before it even began. "We need to focus on what comes next," Marcus said, setting the message aside. His mind began to spin with plans, countermeasures, and possibilities. "If they're going to use fear against us, we need to take that weapon away from them. We need to show the world that we can stand strong, that we're not just surviving, but that we're fighting back with everything we've got." Sarah nodded. "How do we do that?" Marcus paused, deep in thought. "We need a unified front, more than just the people here in Bozeman. We need to spread the word, show the world that humanity is not just cowering. We need to turn this town into a symbol of defiance. If we can unite the rest of the survivors and create something larger than just a resistance, something that shows we are a force to be reckoned with, then maybe, just maybe, we can win the psychological war." Sarah's expression shifted from grim to focused. "You're talking about propaganda. But we need more than just words. We need actions. We need the world to see what we've accomplished here. We need to show them that we're more than just the sum of our parts, that we have the will to rebuild, to fight, to survive. We need to give them hope, not just fear." Marcus met her gaze, a spark of determination igniting within him. "Exactly. And we have to make sure the aliens know it too. We need to send them a message, one that shows them we're not afraid to fight back. This town, this resistance will be a symbol to the world that humanity hasn't lost." The two of them fell into a silence, each lost in thought. Marcus knew they didn't have much time. The invaders would be back soon, and their weapon of terror was already in motion. He could feel the pressure building, not just to fight the aliens, but to rally humanity to a cause larger than survival, to remind everyone that they still had the power to shape their own destiny. "I'll organize the engineers to finalize the energy converter," Sarah said after a moment, breaking the silence. "I'll also help set up communication lines to get word out to the other survivor communities. The faster we get them to understand what we're doing here, the stronger we'll be." Marcus nodded. "I'll speak with the veterans. We need to expand our training. It's not just about having a few weapons. It's about preparing for the long fight. We need to ensure that every survivor is ready to hold their ground. I don't care how they do it, but they need to be mentally prepared for this. If they're going to stand with us, they need to know exactly what they're facing." As Sarah turned to leave, Marcus watched her go, her purpose clear in her steps. He knew the weight of what he was asking of everyone. The world had been forever changed by the invasion, and there was no going back. But if they could unite and hold on to the idea of resistance, of defiance, then maybe, just maybe, They could make the invaders see that Earth was not a prize to be taken, but a force to be reckoned with. Later that evening, Marcus stood at the top of the small hill overlooking Bozeman. The sky was darkening, and the stars were beginning to emerge, dimly lit by the lingering glow of the setting sun. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs. It had been a long time since he'd allowed himself a moment to think, to really consider what they were up against. The town, once filled with the humdrum of daily life, now hummed with purpose. The sounds of people preparing, building, training, strategizing were all around him. But something was different now. There was a new energy, a new determination. The fight wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving to the universe that humanity wasn't going down without a fight. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see General Teague approaching. The general's face was weathered, his eyes tired, but there was a new resolve in his expression too. "We're ready," Teague said, his voice steady and commanding. "The survivors from the nearby towns are organizing, and we've already started reinforcing the town's defenses. But we need your plan. We need to know what's next." Marcus exhaled slowly, his mind clearing. The time had come. There was no more room for uncertainty. He looked Teague in the eye and nodded. "It's time to show the aliens what we're made of. We're going to turn this town into a fortress. We're going to use everything we have to prepare for their return. And when they come, we'll show them that humanity's will to survive is stronger than anything they've ever faced." The general nodded, his expression hardening. "Then let's get to work." And with that, the final stage of humanity's resistance began. The next few weeks passed in a blur of intense planning, construction, and strategic movements. The town of Bozeman, once a quiet, rural town, had transformed into a full-fledged military base. Marcus could feel the pulse of activity in every corner of the town, as civilians and survivors alike worked tirelessly to create a stronghold that would not only defend them, but send a message to the invaders that Earth would not submit. The energy converter was still in its early stages, and Sarah was leading the charge to finish it. She worked tirelessly with the engineers and scientists, pushing the limits of what they knew about the alien technology. The device was being built, slowly but surely, but Marcus knew that it would take more than just one weapon to stand a chance against the coming storm. They needed something larger, something that could truly level the playing field. But Marcus also knew that the invaders would be expecting them to have developed countermeasures. They'd seen how the device worked once. This time the aliens would be ready for it. As Sarah continued to perfect the energy converter, Marcus focused his efforts on building the morale of the survivors. He met with the veterans, strategizing how best to expand their training and prepare the civilians for what was coming. He knew that every person in Bozeman would need to be ready, whether they were wielding a weapon or working in support. Everyone would have a role to play in the coming battle. If they were to stand a chance, they would need to fight as one unified force. The veterans were invaluable in this effort, as they shared their knowledge and trained the survivors in combat tactics. They weren't just preparing them to fight. They were preparing them for the mental toll that would come with facing an enemy that was far beyond anything humanity had ever known. Marcus stood before a group of survivors one morning, his voice carrying over the training grounds. "We have no choice but to fight," he said. "We can't run. We can't hide. This is our world, and we're going to defend it, not just for us, but for our children, our families, our future. The invaders won't just take this planet. They'll erase everything we've built, everything we've fought for. We won't let them. If we stand together, there's nothing we can't accomplish. This is our fight. Let's show them what humanity is made of." The crowd before him nodded, their expressions filled with a mix of fear and determination. They didn't have much choice, but they were willing to stand and fight. And that was all Marcus needed. For the first time since the invasion began, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. Humanity was no longer fractured, no longer cowering in fear. They were fighting back, and that, in itself, was the greatest weapon they had. The survivors weren't just learning to use weapons, they were learning to become a cohesive unit, to rely on each other. The veterans emphasized the importance of teamwork, how they had to be there for one another in the heat of battle. The strength of their unity was what would give them a fighting chance. Marcus knew they couldn't match the invaders' technology or firepower, but they could fight with everything they had. The energy converter was beginning to take shape, but it was clear that the aliens' technology was far more advanced than they had initially realized. Sarah and her team worked around the clock, making adjustments and studying the alien ships they had managed to salvage from the previous attack. The conversion process was delicate, and they were still working out the kinks. If they couldn't stabilize the power source, it could destroy the entire town, something that was too high a risk to take. "How's the converter looking?" Marcus asked, walking into the command center one evening, where Sarah and her team were hard at work. The room was filled with a hum of activity as scientists and engineers studied the blueprints, making final adjustments to the device. "It's coming along," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with both hope and frustration. "We've managed to get the core working, but we're not there yet. The power output is unstable. If we can't stabilize it, it could be catastrophic. We're running out of time." Marcus glanced over the plans, his mind racing as he studied the complex equations and energy patterns they had been working on. The aliens had a grip on the power that drove their ships, and they needed to find a way to turn that against them. The idea was brilliant, but it was also dangerous. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and it could all come crashing down. "I understand," Marcus said, running a hand through his hair, frustration building. "What can we do to help? I know you've got this, but we need results." "We need more time," Sarah said, looking up from the blueprints, her face tired but resolute. "The foundation is there, but we need to get it right. It's not just about building it, it's about controlling it. If we can harness this energy and direct it properly, we'll have a fighting chance. But it's risky. I'm not going to lie to you, Marcus. There's a possibility it could backfire, and we could lose everything." Marcus knew the risks. He had always been a man of logic and reason, but now he was gambling with the future of humanity. There were no guarantees, no second chances. If this worked, it could change the course of the war. But if it didn't, they would be right back where they started, powerless against an enemy that had already wiped out entire cities without a second thought. "We don't have the luxury of time," Marcus replied firmly. "But I trust you, Sarah. If anyone can make this work, it's you. We'll get the resources you need, and we'll support you in any way we can." "I know," Sarah said, her gaze unwavering. "But we need to be ready. The invaders aren't going to wait for us to finish building this. When they return, they'll have a plan of their own, and we need to be prepared for whatever they throw at us." As the days passed, Marcus threw himself into the preparations. The survivors continued to train, fortifying the town and gathering resources. Every spare moment was spent strategizing, calculating, and building. They were in a race against time, and there was no way to know when the invaders would strike again. Finally, the day came when the energy converter was ready for its first test. It was a nervous moment for everyone involved. The machine was a fragile thing, held together by ingenuity and desperation. The team of engineers and scientists had done everything they could to stabilize it, but Marcus knew that the real test would come when it was powered on. As they gathered around the machine, Marcus looked out at the people who had come together to make this moment possible. They weren't soldiers. They weren't trained in warfare. They were ordinary people, farmers, teachers, parents, all united by one common goal: to survive, to fight for their future. Sarah stood by the controls, her hands steady as she activated the converter. A low hum filled the air, followed by a flash of light as the machine came to life. For a moment, there was only silence. And then the room seemed to vibrate, the energy output surging through the system. Marcus held his breath, watching the monitors as the power levels climbed. If it worked, this would be their chance. But if it didn't... "Steady," Sarah muttered under her breath, her eyes locked on the readings. The energy levels peaked, holding steady at a dangerously high level. "Is it stable?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. "It should hold," Sarah replied, her voice filled with both hope and caution. "We'll know soon enough." But just as the energy converter reached its peak, the hum of the machine shifted. A surge of power pulsed through the system, and Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The machine shuddered, and for a moment, he thought it was about to explode. But then, miraculously, the surge stabilized. The machine hummed quietly again, the readings holding steady. It had worked. "We've got power," Sarah said, a grin breaking across her face. "It's stable. We did it." Marcus allowed himself a brief sigh of relief. They had taken the first step. But even as they celebrated the success, he knew the battle was far from over. The aliens would be back, and this time, they would be prepared. The future of humanity rested on what came next. The room erupted into a mix of cautious relief and exhausted joy. The energy converter had worked. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was functional. For the first time since the invasion began, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet optimism. They had a weapon, a real weapon that could turn the tide. But as he stood there, his thoughts drifted back to the looming reality. The invaders weren't done. Not by a long shot. "All right, let's make sure this stays stable," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the celebratory chatter. "We need to test it more thoroughly before we can rely on it." Marcus nodded, his gaze lingering on the machine. For now, it was enough. For now, they had something they could use. The next step would be to refine it, to make it more reliable, to integrate it into their defense systems. But that would have to wait. The invaders weren't going to give them time to perfect their weapon. As the team continued to monitor the machine and make adjustments, Marcus turned his attention to the rest of the town. The preparations were nearly complete. The defenses were set up, the training drills had made the survivors more cohesive, and the morale of the people was at an all-time high. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for their future, for the right to exist as they had before the invasion. The weight of that responsibility was heavy on Marcus's shoulders, but he carried it with a quiet resolve. The next day, word came through the newly established communication lines. Alien ships had been detected at the edge of Earth's atmosphere. They were here. The invaders were coming again. It was time. Marcus felt a surge of urgency in his chest. Everything they had worked for was about to be tested. There was no turning back now. He gathered the survivors, the veterans, the engineers, and the scientists. They had all trained for this moment. They had all prepared for the battle that was about to unfold. Now it was time to stand together and show the invaders what humanity was capable of. "Listen up!" Marcus's voice rang out across the makeshift command center as everyone gathered in front of him. "They're coming, and they won't show mercy. We've got one shot at this. The energy converter is our key, but we need to make sure it works in real combat. The rest of you know your roles. Defend the perimeter. Fight with everything you've got. We're not just fighting for survival anymore. This is for our families, our future, and for everyone who's ever believed in the strength of humanity. We've beaten them before. We can do it again." A cheer went up from the survivors, a raw, powerful sound that sent a wave of pride through Marcus. This wasn't just about holding their ground. It was about making the invaders understand that Earth was no longer a defenseless target. This was a battle for respect, for survival, and for the very soul of humanity. As the alien ships descended from the sky, their dark forms blotting out the sun, Marcus stood with Sarah, Teague, and the others, watching the storm approach. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as the town's defenses came online. The electromagnetic cannons were powered up, the plasma rifles ready, and the traps set. It was an imperfect plan, but it was their only plan. They had no choice but to make it work. "Do you think it'll be enough?" Sarah asked, her voice steady, though there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Marcus turned to her, his face a mask of determination. "It has to be. We can't afford failure, not this time." The first wave of alien ships arrived, their ominous hum reverberating through the town. The sky darkened with their presence, and the ground trembled as their massive ships hovered above the earth. Marcus took one last look at the energy converter, watching as it hummed with raw power. The invaders had underestimated humanity once. This time they would know better. The battle began. The sky lit up with explosions as the alien ships unleashed their devastating weapons, sending torrents of energy crashing into the town's defenses. But humanity fought back, unleashing everything they had. Plasma rifles fired, electromagnetic cannons roared to life, and the energy converter discharged waves of concentrated energy, striking the alien ships and knocking them off course. The invaders retaliated with a fury unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Their weapons cut through the air, obliterating buildings, sending civilians scrambling for cover. But they didn't break the resolve of the survivors. If anything, it fueled their fight. With every alien ship that fell, with every weapon that was destroyed, humanity took one more step toward victory. Marcus was everywhere, coordinating the defense, directing the survivors, ensuring that the energy converter remained functional. Every moment was a blur of explosions and gunfire, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burning debris. His hands were covered in dirt and blood, but he didn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Sarah was with him too, working with the engineers to keep the energy converter stable, making last-minute adjustments to ensure it could handle the increasing power demands. They were pushing it to its limits, but as the battle raged on, they realized they had something the invaders hadn't counted on: human ingenuity. By the time the invaders brought their full force to bear, they were facing more than just resistance. They were facing a united humanity, a humanity that had been pushed to the brink and had risen in defiance. With every blast of energy from the converter, with every soldier who held their ground, Earth's message was clear: we will not go quietly. The invaders, though far superior in technology, began to falter. For the first time since their arrival, they hesitated. They had underestimated Earth, and now they were paying the price. The tide of battle had shifted. But even as the aliens began to retreat, Marcus knew it wasn't over. The battle had been won, but the war was far from finished. The aliens had learned from their mistakes, and they would return, stronger, smarter, and more prepared. But humanity had proven something in those long hours of fighting. They had proven that no force, no matter how powerful, could break their will. As the last of the alien ships retreated into the void of space, Marcus stood among the survivors, watching as the sky cleared. The air was thick with smoke, and the town was in ruins. But they had won. For now. "Is it over?" Sarah asked, standing beside him, her face weary but triumphant. "No," Marcus said softly, shaking his head. "This is just the beginning. But we've shown them that we're not going down without a fight." Together they looked out over the devastated town, knowing that they had given humanity a fighting chance. The war wasn't over, But for the first time, Earth had a future. A future they would defend with everything they had. The message had been sent. Attack again, and face total annihilation. Humanity was no longer just a fragile planet in the cosmos. It was a force to be reckoned with. And the invaders would learn that Earth's spirit could never be broken. Not now. Not ever.